Where's Honey? Yeah. Okay, I think we're getting ready to start today. I want to welcome everybody. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on such a glorious post-holiday weekend. My name is Nancy Lindborg. I'm the president of U.S. Institute of Peace. And I want to start off by thanking International IDEA for its partnership with this event. And I understand there are a number of embassy representatives, and we welcome all of you here. And what an amazing day. I mean, I was watching the news this weekend thinking, I cannot believe they timed this event for this day. And even more importantly, we have with us one of the activists who was instrumental in Saturday's historic referendum. And when I read the President of Ireland's quote about today disclosing who we are as a generous, compassionate, bold, and joyful people, I still am feeling kind of teary. And I can imagine that for Monine, who's here in the front row, who had to tear herself away from celebrations in Ireland. Thank you for joining us, and we are just overjoyed. So you'll hear from Monine later today, but the fact that she got herself on a plane after that historic vote and joined us here today is, I think, yet another affirmation of her commitment to these issues. So this is a critical core issue for our mission. USIP was founded 30 years ago as a nonpartisan, federally funded, independent organization with a very audacious mission, and that is a world without violent conflict. And one of the things that we know very clearly is that you need to be inclusive, and you need constitutions that are inclusive of all people. All people need to be at the table. This event is squarely a part of our mission, and this weekend's event was clearly in the right direction and pointing a pathway forward for all of us. So we are delighted to have everyone here today, all of our panelists, to highlight efforts to how to promote the inclusion of LGBTI voices in constitution-making processes and to learn from your experiences. I also noted it was a big weekend that a new Gallup poll shows that 60% of Americans now favor same-sex marriage. So hopefully we will take heart from what happened this weekend and move to history of our own in the coming weeks, albeit through a different legal mechanism. And I'm very pleased today to introduce the newly appointed U.S. Special Envoy for LGBT Affairs, Randy Berry. Special Envoy Berry is 6 weeks in the post, I think, has already extensively traveled, and brings extraordinary energy and enthusiasm to this post. He's previously served as the U.S. Consul General in Amsterdam, in Auckland, New Zealand, and is a 9-time Meritorious Honor Award recipient who's been been a career member of the State Department and posts throughout Asia. I know what a difference it makes to have somebody with Randy's energy and vision in this kind of a job. And so I'm very proud to be able to introduce you, and we're very delighted that you're in this post. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Special Envoy Berry.
Great. Well, let me just start out by saying good morning, and what a pleasure it is for me to be here with you today. With 6 weeks, under my belt now, I feel that I've got some solid achievements that we can point to already. As I joked at an event last week, most of them are logistical in nature, and I now have a trash can in my office. So I like to say that we're going to count successes wherever we can get them, and I certainly count that as maybe not one of our major successes, but one of our lesser ones. I am incredibly optimistic as I start down this path for the U.S. government. And I wanted to share with you why I believe that is true. When my life changed massively at the end of February when I came back for an appointment ceremony with Secretary Kerry. From that day onwards, my email inbox has grown in ways that I could only have previously imagined. And I will tell you that of the thousands, and I would say at this point tens of thousands of messages that I've gotten, most of them from outside of government, most of them from outside the United States, I can count the number of negative messages that I've received. If you look even at my Facebook page or LinkedIn, because the total number of negative messages that I've received have been 0. Not a single one. What I have had are a huge number of positive offers of assistance from business, from community activists, from grandmothers, from people in every walk of life, and that tells me that I have a superb wind at my back. Although the position is certainly new across the street at the State Department, the work itself is not. So I'm thrilled to be joining the team of very dedicated folks over at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor that are working this space, and we are busy, aren't we, Kristen? We're just about to, I just returned from, I heard the great news about Ireland while I was finishing up a trip in Jamaica, where I think there are some interesting positive things underway there as well. But we're just about to set off on a 15-country, 5-week travel that I'm already tired just talking about it. We are so excited at the State Department that USIP is expanding its excellent work to capture LGBTI initiatives and activities, and we look forward very much to working with you as we expand on our side as well in our engagement on these issues. One of my goals in this new role is to build a very broad set of partners, and that includes with civil society organizations and think tanks. You provide the expertise that often guides our work on the ground. And we are grateful for meetings like today where we can take on a new issue, meet with new experts, and find better ways to be good partners in these issues which we all hold very, very dear. In the past 10 years, we have seen an increasing focus on human rights for LGBTI persons around the globe. And constitutional change has provided a unique opportunity for groups to mobilize for their members' rights and their recognition. I think as you'll hear from our panelists today, some who have experienced the drafting process firsthand, the Constitution of a country reflects the history of its people and its struggles. Constitutions and constitutional courts are powerful tools to protect rights of members of minority groups. Cultural norms, such as patriarchy, are so entrenched in many societies that majoritarian politics have historically had difficulty correcting imbalances and discriminatory practices on their own. So, to overcome inequities, many countries are addressing the rights of members of the oppressed and marginalized populations through the context of their constitutional drafting processes. Many opportunities for constitutional reform occur during transitions, we have seen. Transitional periods allow a country to redefine its identity in a way. And since many of these transitions occur after some form of conflict or denial of benefits of citizenship to one or more parties, the rhetoric of equality is often a central feature of discussions during the drafting. Now, I have a colleague here who you're going to hear from South Africa, and that very much comes to my mind because I think in every one of those examples, it was certainly the case that we saw evolve when the South African Constitution was being drafted. LGBTI individuals, women, and members of other marginalized groups often bear the brunt of violence in times of conflict, and thus the role of these voices is vital in the reconciliation process. It not only ensures the legal protections are enacted, but it also can serve as a healing mechanism, and it certainly surely creates a more durable, healthier nation. Based on this, the legal position of all marginalized groups, which includes LGBTI persons, women, people with disabilities, ethnic and religious minorities, these all lie at the heart of the debate about which values a constitution should reflect when its drafters seek to develop a modern,
pluralistic legal system. You will hear from panelists today, I believe, that in recent years, legal experts, judges, and political leaders in post-conflict countries have struggled to draft constitutions that reflect domestic traditions and religion, which have historical and cultural importance, but also protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Despite these challenges, several countries have indeed codified gender equality into their post-conflict constitutions. The provisions that countries have added to their constitutions have varied widely from general equality clauses to more specific clauses that afford particular rights and protections, such as the right to be protected against violence. I think we will also hear that it's difficult to judge the full impact, benefits, and outcomes of reform efforts thus far. But the text of some new constitutions, and again I'll go back to the South African Constitution as well, again, lays a solid foundation for the equality that all persons deserve. And given the challenges that vulnerable populations face, it is worth our exploring every tool that we have in our box to create and sustain change. President Obama in 2011 issued a memorandum directing what the United States government should be doing on this important issue. And even before that memo, our Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, had prioritized vulnerable persons, including LGBTI persons, in the Department of State's foreign policy agenda. Many of you probably remember the historic speech that she delivered in Geneva on the human rights of LGBTI persons. It was a seminal work and it guides our engagement to this day. The presidential memorandum itself directs our work in 5 key areas, including one area that is very relevant to our discussions today, and that is combating criminalization of LGBTI status or conduct abroad. This is a subject of discussion as I embark on global travel. Some of the countries that we'll be traveling to, frankly, have been ahead of the United States in this process. Some are not, but we're engaging across a very wide spectrum to discuss, to turn over issues, to discuss the issue of human rights in ways that are relevant to greater legal protections. I think it was quite interesting, as I mentioned, I've just returned from Jamaica, where on Sunday the oldest print newspaper and the one with the greatest circulation on the island published what is truly an extraordinary editorial calling for the repeal of what they call the buggery law in Jamaica. It's never been done before. And I think that is a remarkable development because as we've seen, change sometimes comes quickly and sometimes it comes slowly. But I think we need to be focused on advancing the cause, even with small steps where we can. Because same-sex conduct is still outlawed in nearly 80 countries globally. And in a handful of those, the penalty remains death. As part of our work to increase broader recognition of the human rights, we are working to support local, national, and international efforts that aim to both repeal these negative laws that further undermine human rights, as well as promote the passage of new laws that positively reinforce the message of equality. We recognize constitutional reform as a process to achieve both goals and look forward to working with USIP and others to identify reform processes where we and other friendly states can also be supportive. We recognize that the inclusion of LGBTI persons in constitutional reform illustrates on its own a country's commitment to making members of vulnerable groups an equal part of society. We also recognize that the inclusion of LGBTI persons provides an opening for persons to participate in the drafting and decision-making processes that takes place when building a new state. History has proven that LGBTI persons and women are often the best advocates for their own cause. As I say that, I'm recalling I served for a couple of years in Kathmandu just after the end of the civil conflict there. And an openly gay member of parliament by the name of Shneel Pant was instrumental in making sure that greater legal protections and a discussion on issues affecting the LGBTI community in a place like post-conflict Nepal had a central place at the table. And I would encourage you to take a look at what has happened in a legal sense in Nepal since then. That kind of leadership absolutely matters. We can also look to the significant role that prominent LGBTI advocates can also play. as was the case with Constitutional Court Justice Ed Cameron, who played a very key role in the successful inclusion of LGBTI rights in the South African case. Constitutional reform can provide the basis for legal claims of discrimination that can be used as a tool to uproot customs and structures that are prejudicial. As part of our work through the Global Equality Fund, we are supporting civil society in their efforts to encourage more inclusive judicial and legal sector reform. The fund is educating judges on human rights broadly to make sure they are aware of their own constitutions, including non-discrimination provisions which aim to protect all persons. We're also working to support networks of paralegals to support LGBT persons in need of legal redress. If, for example, they are evicted or they lose their job or need help to affirm their rights. All of these efforts aim to feed into broader national processes, and that includes constitutional reform. Through the fund, we've learned about the important role of judges and magistrates and recognize that our legal and constitutional reform initiatives need to be embedded within larger human rights education and awareness efforts, depending upon the local context. The legal trainings that the fund supports relate to broader topics, for example, access to justice for vulnerable persons or promoting equal access to health care for members of all marginalized categories. I understand the panelists have developed case studies based on the challenges and successes that they've faced, and I look forward to reading those studies and using them to inform our own work. This kind of partnership is really critical. That I believe that my role at the State Department will rise and fall on our ability to work across government, across foundations, across businesses, and also with civil society organizations. Because I think the more voices that we have added to the chorus, that diversity matters and that embracing diversity builds strength, whether you're coming from a business background, from a foundational one, from a government one. I mean, I think, you know, from the U.S. perspective, clearly we've got a story to talk about diversity. An honest discussion that is honest about about the steps that it has taken us over many years, over many decades, and I'm not talking just about LGBTI rights, but in making sure that equal access under the law means equal access under the law for all. All of you know, as well as I do, that there's an extraordinary amount of work on our plate, but in working together and making sure we form these partnerships in a spirit of transparency and common cause, I am very, very optimistic that we will create the change that we need. So thank you again for including me this morning, and I look forward to hearing the discussion evolve. Thank you.
Panelists, want to join me up here, please? Good morning again, everyone. My name is Jason Gluck, and I'm a senior program officer here at USIP. I sit in the Rule of Law section, and I head up our constitution-making projects. I want to, again, thank our president, Nancy Limburg, and Special Envoy Berry for your remarks in particular. This partnership that you speak of between USIP and the State Department is critically important to us, and it's one of the things that guides everything we do. And similarly, we know that in working around the world, constitution making for USIP, and I think for a lot of international actors, including the State Department, is really searching for that intersection between the constitutional moment and peace building, using ways, every means possible to help our national counterparts in sometimes very difficult situations, post-conflict, transitional and divided societies, to use the constitutional moment as an opportunity for political transformation, democratic consolidation, and peace. And although we'd like to think we come at this with some experience and knowledge, we know that the best lessons learned, the best practices comes from the ground. It comes from those who have been there, who have actually been part of their own national processes, who have been part of their own political transformation. And we do our best when we leverage that which has come before us, and we try and act as a conduit to bring these lessons learned to other places around the world that are experiencing, who are walking these paths for the first time. Special Envoy, you mentioned the Nepali gentleman, Sunil, who we were actually on Skype with yesterday as we were putting together our case studies. He's a contributor to this project. The purpose behind what you see in front of you is our attempt, and again, I want to acknowledge our partner, International IDEA, for its leadership in this particular project, to bring together those who can demonstrate strategies and tactics and lessons learned and what worked and what didn't, to put together an advocacy guide that we can then share with the people who come next. And so the fact that you met Sunil many, many years ago is just a demonstration in my mind that there are some amazingly bright stars out there, and they can be seen from all directions. And although Sunil couldn't be with us today, I have 5 other of the brightest stars who I'm really excited to have a conversation with and allow you into this conversation today. I want to introduce very briefly, I believe their bios are in the packets that you have, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but Sunit Basaria is the head of the Constitutional Building Program at International IDEA and a long-standing partner to USIP, particularly in their area of constitution making. Michael DeFell is a former law clerk for the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa and is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Cambridge as a Gates Cambridge Scholar. Moninia Griffith is the Director of Marriage Equality, at least now, I don't know for how much longer. You know, you might be the victim of your own success. But in Ireland, where she's just completed a years-long struggle to bring marriage equality to Ireland. Richie Maitland is the co-founder of and the director of Groundation Grenada, a social action collective dedicated to raising awareness and doing legal and policy advocacy around human rights issues in the Caribbean. And then Michelle Reddy is program director for the Fiji Women's Rights Movement. And we're really excited to have them all here today to share their experiences. We're going to have a bit of a moderated discussion right now, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers from you, as well as anyone who might be out there in the Twitter sphere who wants to tweet us questions at hashtag LGBT diplomacy, and we will try and feed that into the discussion as well. So without further ado, I'd really like to get off on a high note here. So as we all know, this weekend was a historical moment, not just for Ireland, but for all of us following these issues closely. Ireland became the first country to legalize same-sex marriage through national referendum. And so again, congratulations to you. What's particularly amazing to me is that this happened in a country where homosexuality was still criminal in 1993. I mean, just over 20 years ago. And so I thought I would start things out by asking you, Moninia, what do you attribute to the sea change? And can you tell us a little bit how we got to this historic moment?
Sure. So there's a number of issues, I suppose there's lots of issues, but the things I think that I'd highlight today are, one is in relation to capacity. So after, as some of you may know, we took a case through the Irish courts. Catherine Zappone and Anne-Louise Gilligan were the plaintiffs in the case. And although they were unsuccessful in their case to have their Canadian marriage recognised in Ireland, what they were able to do is put the issue firmly on the agenda. So for the first time ever, Irish people saw loving, committed, a same-sex couple speaking about having been married and trying to get recognition for that. So they really started a movement in Ireland, and we got together and applied for some funding. And after that, we were able to put together an organisation called Marriage Equality and work as a single issue NGO focused solely on achieving marriage equality in Ireland. So I think it's to do with capacity. Having professional paid staff on board whose sole focus is achieving that goal. So we were able to work with a wonderful voluntary board, have good governance, have a strategic plan, work on mapping out the power structure in Ireland, so how we would achieve this change, and go about this in a very strategic way. working with the media, increasing visibility of LGBT people, making the case for marriage equality in the media, increasing visibility of same-sex couples, of their children, of their extended family networks, and why marriage mattered to Irish people in a very particular Irish way. Because of that, then we saw an increase in public support rise from 56% in 2008 to 73% just earlier this year. We were also able to work capacity build with LGBT activists across the country with our Out Your TD campaign. Our TD is an MP, an elected representative, and we really taught how to lobby, taught ordinary individuals how to lobby, how to go in and talk to their elected representatives in their constituency clinics about why this issue mattered to them, and therefore make the issue both personal for the elected representative and also politically motivate them that this was an issue that voters in their constituency were concerned with. So we increased capacity of people to engage with the political system and change hearts and minds and increase political support. We also did our own lobbying, so it was grassroots and grass tops lobbying going on. So we went in and spoke to our 166 MPs and our 60 senators about the issue and made it real for them, explained to them why it mattered to Irish people. And over the course of the 8 years that we worked on it, therefore, we saw an increase in political support and eventually complete support, cross-party support across the political spectrum. All the political parties adopted an official position supporting the introduction of civil marriage equality for same-sex couples. We also saw then a promise to hold a referendum come about because of that political support, because of that lobbying with the grassroots and the grass tops. And then the Constitutional Convention process, we were able to work with partners. Marriage Equality got together with GLEN, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, and ICCL, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. And together we worked to speak to the members of the Constitutional Convention about why this mattered. And we brought in people to share their stories, young adult children who'd grown up with lesbian and gay parents, got to share their stories about why it was important. And at the end of that process then, when the issue was put to a vote, 79% of the members decided to recommend to government to hold, to insert a positive right for same-sex marriage in the Irish Constitution. They also voted by 81% for the government to recommend to government to put forward legislation to provide for equality for children growing up with lesbian and gay parents. So it was a very interesting process. Also, because of this increased capacity, we were able to build a movement. So we were able to work with our supporters face to face, through the media, and also build a social media movement. So we worked very well getting the message out to supporters and building our base of support. And so all this work, I suppose, laid the foundation for a referendum campaign that took place over the last 88 days. So the capacity was there, the support was there, the movement had been built, and we had identified champions, built coalitions, built a network of people that we could reach out to when we knew the referendum was being called. So we had civil society support and people all over Ireland ready, willing and informed and educated and able to engage with us in the referendum campaign. The other issue, I suppose, was the decline in the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, or the hierarchy. I should say that the Catholic Church is still very important to very many Irish people, and lots of people still identify as Catholic or lapsed Catholic, so their influence is still very strong. But for many people of faith, they make up their own minds now about issues of social justice, issues of civil law. So when it came to the referendum, many Catholics, because they make up their own mind on these issues, were able to vote yes for civil marriage equality, because even though they were people of faith who were devout, for them this was a separate issue to do with equal citizenship and nothing to do with the sacrament of religious marriage. Also, I suppose the increased visibility of gay and lesbian people, and people, well-known people, so very senior politicians, people in the media, coming out and sharing their stories, debunking some of the myths or the stereotypes people had about LGBT people, and really, I suppose, increasing empathy amongst the general public for gay and lesbian people and the case for marriage equality. And lastly, I suppose one thing that I'd like to draw attention to was the global movement towards marriage equality. That created a momentum. It also created awareness. It made the news, made media. Every time another country introduced marriage equality, it added to the momentum and increased awareness about it, and I suppose decreased people's fear or trepidation about what this meant. And also, we were able to then point at countries that had, for a decade had marriage equality and the sky hadn't fallen down. So we were able to allay any fears or concerns that people would have about what would happen to Irish society, what would happen to Irish families after the introduction. And also on a very practical level, then we had friends and allies who had achieved this, and we could work with them and talk to them and share the learnings from their successes and their failures along the way. So we did a great support across the world as well.
Thank you. Well, I have to ask you then, I mean, with all those years and of an incredibly uphill battle, was there a particular moment where you thought, well, we may actually get this?
Well, I always believed we could, because I knew that all we had to do is to tap into Irish people's sense of fairness and equality. And you know that from visiting Ireland, Jason. You know, and also marriage is a very important issue, important institution for Irish people. So we knew if we could explain to Irish people that all this was about was sharing this freedom to people. If you believe that marriage is a good thing for people, for families, for society, then why wouldn't you want to open it up? But there were particular moments, I suppose, that stand out. Our former president, Mary McAleese, a couple of years ago came out in defence. She just said, I'm just glad anyone wants to get married. And she would be well known in Ireland. She's a devout Catholic. She is an expert in canon law. She would be very much seen and respected by Catholic people. And indeed my own father, who'd been listening to me talk about marriage equality for many, many years, it was after he heard Mary McAleese speak about it and say that she was supportive of it, that he and many people like him had a light bulb moment and went, yeah, actually this is something I could support. I can you know, this fits okay. This fits nicely with my own beliefs and my faith systems. Also, things like in more recent times, the children, the young adult children with gay and lesbian parents speaking at the Constitutional Convention. When they got up and spoke, I was sitting on the panel like this, and I was looking around at people's faces, and I could see everybody's faces. Everybody was in awe. Could hear a pin drop, and the temperature of the room changed then, because people's fears, their concerns about if you let gay people get married, the next thing they'll want to do is have children. What will that mean? Think about the children. And here were two wonderful young adults explaining what their lives were like, allaying those fears, addressing those fears, and then people realised actually the kids are all right, so it's okay. That was another standout moment. For me personally, in the last few weeks, we've been on a national bus tour on the Yes Bus, and we have been out having conversations with literally thousands of Irish people in over 80 towns and villages. And those conversations, for me, I really knew we were going to win this after having those conversations, because ordinary Irish people, some who knew gay and lesbian people, some who had children who were gay and lesbian, or who had friends or other family members, spoke very passionately about why this was so important. But others who did not know gay and lesbian people, but felt that this was about the kind of Ireland that we want for ourselves, for future generations of Irish people, that they were going to come out and vote yes. And the reception we got was overwhelmingly positive. So I felt very confident that we could do it. But also, in the last few months and over the last few years, we've seen the groups like Faith in Marriage Equality, a group of people of faith coming out to advocate for this. Groups like that, groups like Belong To, or a national LGBT youth organisation. They got together a coalition of children's rights organisations and other groups working with young people and children to come together to put forward the case for why this matters for young Irish people. So these were all really important moments when I just knew that we were onto a winner. But I suppose for me, the most poignant was on Thursday night, the night before the referendum, was seeing photographs all over Twitter of all the Irish people coming back, all the diaspora coming back to vote in the referendum. Dublin Airport was thronged, the buses, the trains, everything was absolutely packed, and the hashtag Home to Vote and Be My Vote were trending, and I knew we were onto a winner.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And we'll get back to you in a moment. But I want to move for a second from our most recent victory to one of the earliest. And Michael, South Africa, the constitution-making process itself has almost become a rallying cry, a reference point for so much of the world in a number of respects. I mean, the process, the moment, obviously, was this, pivotal ushering out of apartheid and into democracy in South Africa. But we look at your experience with a bit of reverence, both the process, because it was so open, it was so participatory, it was so inclusive. We take a lot of those principles and we do try and impart them to countries that where we work. The Constitution itself is so progressive. South Africa's Constitution, 1996, was the first one in the world to recognize sexual orientation as a protected class in its equality provision. And what amazes me is that you have this success, this unprecedented milestone reached in this incredibly participatory national dialogue of a constitution-making process, and yet it seems as though the strategy on the part of the LGBTI, or maybe it was G at that time, the activists, in trying to get this recognition and these rights was very much an elite one. That it was gay activists working directly with constitutional drafters, maybe largely outside the public eye, and certainly outside many of these public forums. I'm wondering if you could share with us the reasons behind this strategy of elite versus the grassroots advocacy that we just saw in Ireland, and perhaps talk a little bit about the repercussions as you see it, 20 years later from that strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think you're correct. South Africa provides a different model towards the protection of LGBTI individuals. So I think perhaps just to give a bit of context, the process that South Africa was going through at the fall of apartheid, I think it provided an opportunity for elite, and I say that with the utmost respect, within the LGBT community, to use this process to advance their interests as well. Now, of course, South Africa, unfortunately, still to this day, has severe negative attitudes towards the LGBTI community. So a grassroots, social-based movement, as we saw in Ireland, was never going to be an option. And so, having that in mind, I think very prominent leaders and academics within the LGBTI community took it upon themselves to coordinate a very strategic and focused campaign that would ensure, we were a little bit more progressive than you give us credit for, to ensure that in 1993, during the interim constitution, that sexual orientation would be a protected ground in the Equality Clause, and that happened. And we became the first country in the world to do so. And that prohibition continued into the 1996 final constitution. How did they do it? Well, they had to, of course it was a very open process, and I guess all the main political actors knew what was going on. But in some sense, the strategy relied on being a little bit quiet. So, for instance, another good contrast to the Irish example is ideas of marriage and adoption were swept under the rug. So they were focusing on ideas of decriminalizing same-sex marriage. And I think that was kind of what the narrative that they were forwarding to the drafters and negotiators of the Constitution. I guess what we should also keep in mind is what worked in favor of the inclusion of this prohibition on sexual orientation, or discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, was the fact that South Africa was coming out of an era where we saw mass oppression and discrimination predominantly on the basis of gender and race. And I think this created a doorway, or opened a doorway, to advance the argument that the type of oppression and discrimination that LGBTI persons faced during the apartheid regime was in many ways very similar to what had happened on the grounds of race and gender. And so I think that narrative helped advance the cause. That being said, and we may classify it as an elitist approach, but I think broadly speaking, the LGBTI community did support what was happening. And I think this was evidenced by the fact that during the drafting of the 1996 final constitution, when and as you say, it was a very open process and any person could actually write submissions to the committee. Surprisingly, they received more petitions in support of including this prohibition against discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation than what they received against it. What I also want to say is that after the adoption of the final constitution, this very elitist strategic pathway was continued. So the main national coalition at the time once again devised up a strategy that would seek to incrementally challenge the existing law. So they would start with the most egregious violations and try to progressively test the waters and try to progressively move up to the recognition of same-sex marriage. And I guess that resonates within the US context as well. So in 1998, they brought the criminalization of same-sex before the courts, and the courts invalidated that law. Over the next couple of years, additional challenges were brought, which were aimed at ensuring that same-sex partnerships received many of the same legal benefits or entitlements that married couples get. And that all accumulated in 2005, I think I stand corrected on that, when marriage equality was brought before the courts. The Constitutional Court, which contained members that I think were very sympathetic to the gay rights movement, held that the law as it stood was unconstitutional, and they referred it back to the legislature for remedy. A year later, South Africa became the 5th country in the world and first in Africa to recognize same-sex marriage. I suppose when we compare it to a grass-based or social-based movement, I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. Reflecting on the South African experience, the major advantage was in terms of securing legal protection, it worked. Within a space of 10 years, we went from recognizing 13 years, we went from recognizing sexual orientation as a protected ground in our constitution to recognizing same-sex marriage. There, however, is a drawback, and I think whenever we think about legal change, social legal change, bringing about social change through legal mechanisms, I think we need to keep something at the back of our mind, is that because it was never a grass-based movement, because it was never a social-based movement, still to this day, South Africa doesn't have a major civil society organization that keeps the pressure on our government to ensure that LGBTI interests are constantly protected. And I think at times we feel the ramifications of that in today's society. So there's still severe homo prejudice within society, and that sometimes takes the form of lesbians being subjected to what we call corrective rape, where men try to remove their sexual deviances. Sometimes that results in murder. And of course, LGBTI persons are still subject to severe ridicule and harassment within society. So legal change obviously doesn't actually, or tends not to also affect social change. So there is a disadvantage that I think the South African experience speaks to, and something that I think any other country that wants to embark on this process also has to consider.
Thank you. But correct me if I'm wrong. It wasn't a decision we prefer an elite approach to grassroots. It was the recognition that a grassroots effort at that time was unlikely to be successful.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, we can see these things. We look back at these things and think that there was a concerted strategy, and I think there was that recognition. But I think there were just people responding to the process, and saw that this was the best opportunity for a couple of people to come forward to be engaged with the new political elite to ensure that LGBTI persons get protection in the future.
Thanks, Michael.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Michelle, Fiji has a very interesting history regarding recognition of sexual minorities. Each of Fiji's 3 constitutions since 1990 have included some recognition in inequality provision, and they've become increasingly more inclusive and progressive at each iteration. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit about Fiji's experience, the evolution of this language, what you think it tells us about LGBT rights in Fiji, and particularly regarding constitution making.
Fiji has a colorful history, as I'm sure all of your countries have as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about the process itself in terms of each of those constitutions. Well, technically, we have 3 constitutions and 1 constitution that was not accepted by the interim administration at that time. So 4 constitutions. I wanted to really highlight that in terms of constitution-making process, it's really important that the process itself is participatory and that it has the political will of the people. Otherwise, as we've heard, it can be difficult along the way. In terms of the language, yes, there has been progressive language used in Fiji's constitution. In 1990, we have broad definitions or rights to equality and non-discrimination. In the 1990 Constitution, we actually have the word sex used in it. And then in 1997, 7 years on, we've actually used the words gender and sexual orientation to the Yashkai Constitution, or also known as the People's Constitution. Quite broad definition, which is reflected in the Constitution that was passed by government in the 2013 one. And in this particular constitution, we have a broader definition, very progressive, uses the word gender, sex, it also uses sex orientation, gender identity and expression. So in terms of the language, it's been really great. But there's also challenges within the 2013 Constitution. So whilst you might have a really progressive language, you also need to look at the progressive language in terms of other sections of the Constitution. So for example, the 2013 Constitution, whilst it gives this really great language, it also limits it specifically to non-discrimination and not positive realization of universal human rights. Particularly, it prevents, there's an exception in the Bill of Rights portion of the 2013 Constitution that talks about limiting these rights in cases of marriage. So a long way to go for Fiji in terms of the island case study. So there are 3 exceptions in terms of marriage, adoption, and also inheritance. So there are exceptions and limitations within this constitution. The other really challenging part of the 2013 Constitution is, for the first time ever, and we've taken some of the lessons from the South African Constitution, it has broadened the Bill of Rights. So we've got some rights that we never had in the previous constitution. For example, there are explicit rights in relation to social and economic rights, but there's also a caveat in the Bill of Rights because you can limit those rights. And the language that's used in the current constitution talks about, there's a section that says that the state can make limitations expressly prescribed or authorized or permitted, whether by or under a written law. In the previous constitutions, there was a language that said, of course you can limit certain rights, but the limitations and the language that was used in the last few constitutions talked about that it must be reasonable and justifiable in a free and democratic society. We don't have that language in the current constitution. And from experience and international standards, this is a concern for LGBTI groups. My last challenge that I wanted to talk about is, whilst you have really great progressive language in a constitution, it doesn't necessarily mean that it trickles down to full realization. It doesn't really mean that lives automatically change. You've got to talk about political will of the state in putting across resources. You've also got to look at the culture of those different structures, whether they do believe in LGBTI rights. One of the things that the LGBTI groups in Fiji had put forward in their submission was the reinstatement of the Fiji Human Rights, which is now known as Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, that must be compliant with Paris principles. The state has said that they would and have actually appointed commissioners, which is a great start. The problem is in the current constitution, there's also another section which actually limits the kinds of cases and matters that the Human Rights Commission can look at. So for instance, there's a specific section that talks about the matters that the Human Rights Commission cannot look into. And so any matters prior to 21st of August 2013, the Human Rights Commission cannot actually investigate. And a lot of anecdotal evidence from members of the LGBTI groups in Fiji show that a lot of human rights violations are actually undertaken by state members or partners. So again, great progressive language, but there are challenges within this current constitution that could really be detrimental to the full realization of LGBT rights.
Thanks, Michelle. Richie, so Grenada is currently in the midst of constitutional reform, and I know you've been on the front lines and had some interesting experiences that I'd like you to share with our audience here today. But what's noteworthy is that, at least as of now, we have draft amendments that are being tabled before the Parliament.
Yes.
That are likely to go to referendum. Those amendments do not include any recognition of sexual orientation in the equality provision. They do not include any explicit right for LGBTI citizens. And yet, you sit here before us. Do you consider your efforts a failure? How would you characterize what's happening in Grenada right now in terms of LGBTI advocacy?
Okay. I would not categorize it as a failure at all. As you reference, the Grenada Constitution actually requires, besides a parliamentary special majority, a referendum for amendments to take place. There was a poll study done in 2014 that was released in November 2014 that was sponsored by UNAIDS that looked at, among other things, the kind of state of homophobia in Grenada. What emerged from that study was some statistics that weren't necessarily shocking but were bad. So about 38% of respondents indicated that they had strong homophobia amounting to hate, that they hated LGBTI people. Just about 54% said that they would not lime or hang out with a homosexual person. And about 59% of respondents, close to 60%, indicated that they did not believe that LGBTI people should have equality. So we kind of knew going into this advocacy around constitutional reform that it would not have been successful. What our push was, though, was to sort of make it a public conversation, because prior to our engagement with the constitutional reform process, this has never really been a public issue. It has never formed part of the national political discourse. We've tried to engage governments in the past. We've sent papers to the Attorney General's office, and they've been completely ignored. Actually, I met the person who was the Attorney General in court. We had a matter together sometime after submitting the paper, and I introduced myself to him, and I indicated, hey, I'm the person who sent you that paper. He laughed and he said, well, we have a special place where those go, never to be seen again. So what our engagement with this issue around constitutional reform did was really make it a public conversation. No, there's a commission that was established by the government for the purpose of determining and making proposals around constitutional reform. They accept written submissions, so we in fact did a very detailed written submission to them, and they invited us to present before the nation, essentially, before hundreds of people at the National Trade Center and at an event that was also being live cast. I think that in their minds, they thought that we would have simply backed down from the issue because we would not have wanted to expose ourselves to the risk that advocates face necessarily. But we actively took up the challenge, and we went and addressed the nation. It was extremely contentious, but what happened was that there was a lot of news coverage. There were a lot of robust debates happening on virtual media and in actual media and on the streets around these issues, and there were a lot of conversations where homophobia actually was able to sort of be unpacked. And I really believe that it is within this conversational space that we are able to unpack homophobia, that we are able to see the misconceptions for what they are, that, actually no, gay men are not pedophiles, that actually no LGBTI people have existed across space, time, and history, including within the Caribbean context, and really to unpack and disaggregate a lot of the misconceptions that underpin and inform homophobia. And we believe that national discussion has really been instrumental in shifting and starting to shift attitudes. So while it might be perceived as a failure in some regard, we see it as a success, and we kind of knew going into it that this would have been the success coming out of it.
It's incremental, isn't it?
Yes, definitely.
I mean, you're on. It's a long war, not a quick fight.
Right.
Well, if anyone wants to go to Richie's website, Groundation.
Yes, it's groundationgrenada.com.
There's a video of this presentation that he and a colleague gave at this public forum last year, where the two of them are resoundingly booed, attempted to be booed off the stage when they introduce themselves and the issue that they're there to speak about. They persevere, and they really do change hearts and minds there in the public forum. And so I also don't think it's a failure.
Right.
We're always hoping to achieve more, but it's amazing the progress that's being made.
Certainly, because we went from being booed in the beginning to actually being applauded by some members of the congregation in the end, of the audience. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to turn to Summit. Summit is, well, as an American, I'm unlikely to ever have the opportunity to actually be a constitution maker for my country, at least, and. So I'm always envious of people who, even if they're experiencing difficult times in their countries, have this seminal moment. They can be a founding father or a founding mother. Summit, as a UK national, I don't know what's going to happen, what opportunities might be presented. But despite that, we have dedicated our careers to studying constitution making, to trying to bring lessons learned and to assist others who are going through it. And so I'm wondering, from where you sit, maybe why is constitutional recognition so important, or is it? Are there alternative paths towards the realization of LGBTI rights other than through constitutions and constitution making?
Yeah, thanks. Well, whatever happens, I don't think we'll end up with a written constitution in the UK, so that's pretty sure. But thanks very much for having us here, first of all, and thanks to USIP for all your support on this project. It's been a real pleasure to work with Jason and his colleagues. Yeah, so is constitutional recognition so important? Well, say a couple of things. So one, let's think about what it is that we're doing when we put things in a constitution, right? So in the UK, we have parliamentary sovereignty, and we don't really have, we have the European Human Rights Act now, but we don't really have a Bill of Rights like you have in America. What we're doing when we put those things in a Bill of Rights or in a constitution is we're saying that these are more important than transient majorities' desires, right? These are to be protected. Even if 99% of the population are going to vote against this, you can't take away my right to freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And so one thing I would say with regards to LGBTI rights and similar marginalized minority rights is if those constitutional rights are not there to protect the most vulnerable in society, then who are they there for? They're certainly not going to do much work if they're there just to protect the strong, who will have the majority on their side. So I think that's one thing that's important to recognize. And secondly, there's this political constitution and this nation-building aspect of the constitution that we see in a lot of cases, in South Africa perhaps being an archetypal example of that. So during the constitution-building process and when Richie's going to these public consultations, or when we hear the presidents of Ireland's words that your president of USIP read out before, what's happening is also the Constitution is defining the political community for this country, right? It's really defining what does it mean to be a South African? What does it mean to say that with South African, what values does this exhibit? And so we believe that should be a really inclusive process as much as possible, that everyone should have their voice in defining these national values. In South Africa, it was called the birth certificate of the nation, or the soul of a nation, by Hassan Ibrahim. Nice turn of phrase. So the process needs to be as inclusive as possible, and it's this moment of higher lawmaking, so it generally should be more inclusive, more consensus-based than ordinary majority lawmaking. And so I would think those two reasons really do argue for seeking to include the vulnerable and most disempowered members of society. And as Richie said to us yesterday, he said, if there's one thing the international community can do, it's just get us to the table. Because without the international community, we're not even at the table. And I think that was a really important point about why constitution making as a participatory inclusive process is so important. Yeah, and the last thing I would say is, so you said are there other mechanisms? There certainly are, and in America you're not rewriting your constitution, you're seeking judicial clarification and interpretation of how the current constitution might apply to same-sex marriage. And so those are other ways of doing that. And in South Africa too, right, they didn't put same-sex marriage in their constitution, and Michael explained this to us yesterday, that they said, we're just going to say that this is not a grounds for discrimination, and then it will be open to society, the legislature, and the judiciary to discuss together what that means for South Africa. And Cass Sunstein calls that incompletely theorized arguments. And I think that's an important way, too, to look at a constitution, that it should express values that everyone can agree on, and everyone can agree on equality and non-discrimination based on who you are. And then, this is a way to look at what's happening in Grenada, right? You don't want to rule out any sector of society because you want everyone to see that they have a future. With regards to LGBTI issues, one sees that there are a lot of countries, Kenya, the participant couldn't be with us here today, and some Eastern European countries, where they are excluding at the constitutional stage same-sex marriage or LGBTI rights and recognition at the Constitution. So I think that's a worrying aspect. But in general, I would say that we have to understand that the constitutions are doing a different thing than law. They're doing something political. They're doing something that's based on national identity, and that's very important, therefore, to be inclusive. Thanks.
So if I could open this up to all of our panelists, I think we're all very interested in your personal journeys or experiences in terms of championing these issues. Maybe you could talk about some of the risks that you face, either as individuals or as organizations and networks along the way. Anything stand out in anyone's mind? Maybe something that you could anticipate others coming after you in other places might encounter themselves. Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, two come to mind. One is a risk in relation to the coalition building and working together. In the Irish context, marriage equality as it says on the tin, we were working towards opening up civil marriage to same-sex couples. There was another organisation, a national LGBT organisation that was working towards civil partnership. So there was a potential there for things to get quite nasty. But instead, we worked together. There were friendships there, personal relationships there. Members of our board were on their board, and that. So it was important to try and hold things together. And in fact, then when it came to the Constitutional Convention, we worked together on that, and we realised that despite our very different ways of working and perhaps our different political with a small p approaches, that it was important for us to work together and to come together if we were going to achieve our ultimate goal. So sometimes it is about having to work together, even if, you know, that prospect it doesn't seem immediately what you want to do. So that was one thing. To unite the LGBT community, we had to come together. We had to present a united front, and we had to present that to the Irish public, and we had to present it to the media and to the political classes as well. The second one was in relation to advocates like myself coming out and sharing our personal stories. And at the beginning, 8 years ago, when we started doing that, there weren't many people who were keen to do that, keen to go into national or their local media and open up their personal stories, their personal histories. And you know, I have to mention Catherine Spone and Anne-Louise Gilligan again, who were so brave to take that case and put themselves out there, because at the time, well, certainly the first ones I remember ever doing it, and that can come at huge personal cost. You're obviously outing yourself. There's no going back into the closet once you're in the media. Everybody knows about it, and so that can be very scary. And we found that then in the last few months campaigning, we were asking ordinary individuals to go out and canvass, to knock on doors, to go to shopping centres and ask people to vote yes. And the most persuasive way we found was them talking about why they were going to vote yes. Instead of saying, these are the facts, these are the reasons, it's about equality, it's about da-da-da. It was, I'm voting yes because I have a lesbian sister. I'm voting yes because I'm a mum, I have 2 kids, and I want them to grow up in a world that treats all our, or in a country that treats all our citizens equally. So that was a risk, that was a risky strategy, and we knew it paid off. So what we had to do then, I suppose, is look at ways of minimising that risk or putting supports in place. And what we did with our canvassers is we provided training. We provided daily updates in relation to briefings. We provided other resources, counselling workshops, tips from psychologists and for experienced canvassers in relation to minding yourself. We also asked people to go out in twos, to have a buddy, to check back in with people afterwards. All these very practical ways of minding yourselves. Also, the people that we asked to go out and do media, we never just sent them out to do any media. What we did is we coordinated that, so we made sure that when they were speaking to media, that journalist or researcher was well briefed, well informed, that they wouldn't put them up against somebody that would expose them to, you know, terrible hatred or having to defend their own personal lives against somebody who was going to come at it from a very a theological point of view or an academic point of view. And we gave them media training, so not putting words in their mouth, but how to handle the media and how to know when they were asked a question that they didn't want to answer, how to stop that. So it was really important for us. There were risks, but so we had to mind ourselves, mind our advocates, and mind our canvassers, and we learnt that as we went.
I would say it's similar to Maninia. As activists in the Caribbean region, we face risks around developing a common politics and the way that discordant politics can really damage a movement. We also face the risk, particularly now, being engaged in some impact litigation. And we actually have some really interesting legal cases now in the Caribbean before national courts, as well as the Caribbean Court of Justice around LGBTI rights. But taking cases without necessarily doing the analysis to determine whether it's best to do so, because of course one negative precedent operates as a precedent for many years to come, binding and persuasive. So that's certainly a risk that we really have to think about and address. The other risk is really personal and organizational, because in the Caribbean, whether you are LGBTI or perceived to be LGBTI by virtue of your advocacy, there's this hostility that you get from the public that I've certainly been exposed to, that my organization has certainly been exposed to. And as I indicated, it's not only personal, but it's also organizational in a sense of potential government sponsors saying, don't give any funds to this particular organization or that kind of thing. my thing though in addressing those fears is you just kind of have to do it. You know, when we were on the Skype call with Sunil yesterday, he said something that really spoke to my heart. You know, he said, the more fearful you are, the more powerful they become. And so I just, you know, I think it's just important as activists in the region to just do the work. But of course, it's for everybody to determine where and how they advocate and where they draw the line in relation to advocacy and personal safety or exposure to risk.
Yeah, please.
I just also wanted to add to the conversation about coalition building, because it can become really draining and tiring. But it's even more important because there's several actors in a different context, and you're not, you know, it's almost like building movements within movements, and it does take a lot of time. The risk of not, you know, paying attention to it is that you lose out on support that other groups can provide. But you also lose out on experiences of other LGBTI groups who perhaps work in different fields than another LGBTI group. So in terms of coalition building and relationship, I think it's always important that when we are managing risk or looking at risk, that you're also looking one at the external risk that you might face as an individual organization or as a big movement, but also the internal risk. And we had this conversation yesterday about, you know, how often do we actually take the time to look after ourselves? It's a really, really hard place to work, and it's tiring. You know, how often do we switch off? How often do we turn off our phones and decide, well, today it's going to be a me day. You know, I'm not going to reply to emails. I'm not going to look at Facebook or Twitter or any of that thing. I'm just going to really focus on myself, on my loved ones, on the people that really, you know, for me are important at this moment. And that's one of the things that I think we tend, as activists and advocates, to forget most of the time, because we tend to focus on the external and not focus also on how important it is to sustain ourselves and other people along the way, so that we can go further, you know, and more effectively.
Thanks. Michelle, let's stay on this issue of coalition building for a moment then, because it seems like the ability to mobilize both within the community and then certainly outside it is central to effective advocacy and successful outcome. I'm wondering if any of the panelists could discuss a little bit about the strategies, the tactics, the challenges that you encountered when you were dealing with both allies and adversaries and trying to build coalitions. Anyone?
So I suppose with the allies, it was really important for us. I mean, as a what was seen by the majority as a minority rights issue. You know, we knew we couldn't do this by ourselves. So we have spent a lot of time over the last year, 8 years, building this coalition throughout civil society in Ireland, with NGOs working on human rights and equality, trade unions, employers, women's groups, men's groups, groups working on children's rights. And it does take a lot of energy, and it's not coalition building for the sake of coalition building. You know, so it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of personal relationships, building on those, and finding the commonality, which means sometimes that you have to help out them as well. You know, so it does add to your workload. But it's, you know, it for us anyway, was crucial, and it was one of the major reasons that the movement was so successful. So that was our approach. We tried to, and with a very small staff team, that was difficult. But it was absolutely necessary. And in the end, what came out of that then was the relationship between the three lead organisations and the referendum, and then a very long list of partner organisations that mobilised their own members, their own lists, their own supporters, so that the movement at the end of the day, the Yes Equality referendum movement, was representative of pretty much every person, every type of person living on the island of Ireland. So we had champions and advocates speaking out and explaining to people who looked like them, sounded like them, why it was important for them to go and vote yes. So it was very worthwhile.
Were there moments where your coalition was tested?
Oh yes, I mean sometimes, I mean in a small country like Ireland, one of the big issues is around funding. So, and we set up in 2008, right before everything, took a big nosedive. So funding in relation for civil society work, for NGOs, our government didn't have any money, so we were all, we didn't get any money from the government, but for many of our partners, their capacity was significantly reduced for this kind of coalition work. So that was extraordinarily difficult and challenging for them. Our own funding, in Ireland, there were two major foundations that were funding a lot of the work that was going on in relation to social justice. Both of them wrapped up over the last couple of years. So that was hugely difficult then for us to continue the work, for our partners and our coalition partners and our allies to continue the work. And then you were also competing with each other for funding, for a limited pot of funding. So that was really stressful and really difficult. And sometimes then in the political sphere, there were times when, you just had to be mindful of other people's political objectives and goals. And then when I look at the people on the no side, I mean, we just very much took the approach not to be negative about them. So the no side got very dirty, used lots of red herrings. There was, and they outspent us, I'd say, by 4-1. But they continuously went on about how much money we were getting, how we were well funded, how it was groupthink, how it was this, that, and the other. And we just decided not to engage with any of that and not to retaliate. We just kept focused on what our goals were, what our messages were, and then we relied on independent bodies of lawyers, of legal representatives to come out and to address some of those red herrings. We did so ourselves, and then in the end, the Independent Referendum Commission also was able to address some of those. So we just kept our eye on the goal and the prize, and we didn't really get into a slagging match, if you like, with them, and we didn't call out the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. We decided not to go there. We knew it would alienate people who wanted to support us. We just kept things positive and focused on what we were trying to achieve.
I would say as well that in the Caribbean, at least, people see arguments as having less merit when they perceive them to be self-interested. So, LGBTI people arguing for LGBTI rights, bah humbug, that kind of attitude. And where we have been able to achieve some changes, where really we have been able to build a coalition which involves other movements. So for instance, in St. Lucia, in 2012, they amended their Employment Act to extend legislative protections from discrimination to LGBTI people, and that was very much also because the activists in St. Lucia would have engaged employment-related organizations, both locally and abroad, for parliamentarians to really see that this is kind of an employment-related issue as well. It's not just about LGBTI and their self-interest, but this affects people in their work, and workplace discrimination is one of the most significant forms of discrimination that LGBTI people in the Caribbean face. So, allying, to use that word, with people is quite crucial to the LGBTI movement in the Caribbean. As for adversaries, I would say that it's important as well to really engage adversaries, and I'll say why. In the Caribbean, the biggest adversary, I would say, to LGBTI issues have been the church historically. They've been very much oppositional, they've been very much hostile. But the thing is, Christianity and the church in the Caribbean historically has been very significant. It's very interwoven into our culture. So in Grenada, for instance, is about 90% Christian, and in the same UNAIDS poll study that I referred to earlier, just about 64% of respondents indicated that it was religious views that informed their homophobia, and I don't think that would shift anytime soon. So what we've been trying to do was really engage churches and church leaders to sort of change the rhetoric for people to sort of understand that this might be my religious view, but because my religion says a particular thing, it doesn't mean that I should advocate for denying people their rights or that sort of thing. So much the same sort of strategy that LGBTI activists in South Africa would have employed in engaging, for instance, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and that sort of thing. That's quite important. I'd also like to flag that it's important how we engage allies and how allies are represented. So, for instance, in the Caribbean, there's this idea that LGBTI advocacy is this depraved foreign phenomenon that is being imposed by weaker countries by more powerful countries. And you all might be aware, for instance, of the impact Obama's statements had, where I believe it might have been around 2 years ago. There were statements by the US indicating that they would withdraw aid from Uganda if certain things weren't done. And activists in Africa responded by saying overwhelmingly that it certainly wasn't helpful. It helped to sort of reinforce this idea that this was something that was being imposed from abroad. And so we have to be very careful how we engage, particularly international allies. And I think that for us in the Caribbean, the ways that we wish to be supported and the ways that we think support can be meaningful is for international allies to provide us the technical assistance to build capacity to do the kind of work that we need to do, and to leverage their positions of power to bring us to the table with governments where we otherwise might not be able to do so. So for instance, when we had engaged with the constitutional reform process last year, our government had gotten some assistance from international agencies, had gotten funding to do the town hall style meetings and to do the PR work. And they had gotten some funding from the UN, and there was actually a visiting UN delegation that Jason was a part of, and that's actually how I met Jason. And what that delegation had indicated to the commission was, okay, we want to hear from some minority voices. So they were able to leverage a meeting between LGBTI activists in Grenada and the Constitutional Commission. So we think those kinds of engagements are quite important, but not engagements, where this sort of international pressure is applied, particularly bilaterally or so by governments saying you need to do this or else. We don't think that those sort of engagements are helpful at all.
Could I also just add, I think when it comes to working with allies and adversaries, it's one of the things that's worked quite well is looking at it as being an inclusive space and making sure that it's an inclusive space. And we have two really great mantras that we have back at work that I'm sure you've heard of. One is that the personal is political, and nothing about us without us. So you can't talk about LGBTI rights if you don't have the groups in the room, and that you talk on their behalf. I mean, it's great if they do, that you consult with them, but I think nothing about us without us is a really good mantra to have, because you need to ensure that it's an inclusive space. And sometimes spaces can be hard to get, Richie has talked about how international actors can actually be helpful in providing a space at the table. But there's also the other tactic of actually really claiming the space for yourself. So if you have an ally, you can always get a women's rights group or children's rights groups to say, hey, there's another great group that you should have at the meeting. Please ensure that you invite them. So you're claiming those spaces and ensuring that there are voices, diverse voices at those spaces. There's also the other tactic of actually creating new spaces. So if you're not invited to these spaces, you can actually create your own space and make it as inclusive as possible. And there's two great examples back in Fiji where we've created spaces, forums actually. They're called the Fiji Women's Forum and the Fiji Young Women's Forum. And for the first time ever, we've had diverse women, including LGBTI groups, in those spaces. It's quite vibrant and exciting for us because it's the first time, well, one of the few times over the last few years where we've actually created our own space and claimed that space and hung on to those spaces and ensured that there is inclusive voices in those spaces.
Thanks, Michelle. I want to open up the question and discussion to you who have come and joined us today. There are two microphones on either end of the room. If you wanted to approach either one of them, please introduce yourself. You can ask a question to the entire panel or to a specific member of the panel. And if there's anything happening in the Twitter sphere, from all of the people around the world watching this on live stream, please let me know that as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is
I think so.
my name is Marko Karadžić. I'm from Belgrade, Serbia. Former State Secretary for Human Rights. I have done a lot of things with regard to LGBT issues, and that was one of the reasons I had to leave my country. Now I'm a consultant with UNDP on LGBT rights and policy. I want to thank you for all those inspiring stories. I've learned a lot, but specifically about the Irish case, I want to congratulate you, but I don't feel as if that's a case for congratulating, because it's in a way also sad that it's 21st century, that we have to wait from a majority to allow us to use our human rights. So do you really believe that this is a good example that we have to follow? Or now we have a lot of work ahead of us to explain that that's not a good way to go ahead, that is actually a dangerous precedent that later on some undemocratic states or where popular opinion is not as tolerant as it is in Ireland might use as a democratic way to exclude the minority as LGBT people. Thank you.
Well, the first thing I'd say is it wasn't our first choice. We wanted to achieve this through the courts, and we were unsuccessful. And so we were building the movement, really, to achieve this through our parliament. But there was no political will to do that. The Attorney General in Ireland had given his opinion that it would require a referendum to amend the Constitution to allow for marriage for same-sex couples. So in some way it was taken out of our hands, the choice of the route. And yes, I mean, at the time, very many of us were very disappointed that minority rights were dependent on a majority of people voting on it, and so we were, a lot of us were heartbroken about that. But they were the cards we were dealt, and so we had to pick ourselves up off the floor and deal with that, and continue the movement building and the momentum building. And I have to say, there were days that I was standing, I told this story last night, and I'll try not to get upset again, but there were days when I was out on canvases asking people to vote yes, when, and I spoke to a woman, she was 58, and she said, and I'll paraphrase because she used quite colourful language, she said, I can't believe I'm out here, I'm 58 years old, and I have to ask people for the permission to get married to the person that I love. It's so humiliating. So it took its toll. It had huge personal toll for very many people. So I would say it shouldn't be, for me personally, it's a risky route. And if there are easier ways to do it, I think they're the ways to do it. However, winning this way was extraordinary. I live in Dublin, and most of the time I'm happy about people recognising me for the work that I do, or from seeing me in media or whatever. But I'd still be sometimes uncomfortable about holding my partner's hand in public, and that I'd still be a bit fearful about that kind of thing. But when she was dropping me to the airport to come out here, on Sunday morning. Sorry, getting upset. And we held hands. And I felt for the first time I could hold her hand in public and not be afraid, because the majority of Irish people came out and voted yes. I felt like an equal citizen because the majority of Irish people had said, yes, you are equal, and yes, we'll stand up for you, and we'll come out in a landslide in numbers that were unprecedented. No other referendum has seen this kind of number of Irish people come out to vote. So in terms of affirmation and vindication, it was the most powerful expression that I can imagine, and that was wonderful. But it was a scary road. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a question?
Hi, I'm Laura Ballard. I work at the State Department. First of all, I have to say, being a volunteer activist for a few years, trying to bring about the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell through grassroots action, I completely hear everything you were saying about coalition building and fundraising and competition. So I think doing a grassroots campaign like that has tremendous value. And yes, it's great when we can bring that about through court action, but I also think that the kind of person-to-person contact you have through canvassing has its own value. To that end, I wanted to ask the whole panel just for your thoughts on how the internet has affected the LGBTI community and LGBT activism. I think I know the answer for Ireland because I've been watching YouTube videos of LGBT Irish people calling their nanas for several weeks now. But I wonder if in some of the other countries we run into the same sorts of divides between rural and urban, or between higher and lower socioeconomic status that might be limiting its potential. So all the panelists, but I think in some of the places where we think grassroots activism faces even greater challenges than Ireland. Thank you.
So I'd say for my own context that the internet has been very positive. So there is this kind of urban-rural divide. But in Grenada, there's about 43% internet penetration. So a lot of people, particularly young people, have access to the internet. And the Caribbean is not like other contexts where we can have pride parades and walk around with rainbow flags and that sort of thing. That can be quite dangerous in certain contexts. So what the internet has done is allowed us a virtual platform to do advocacy, and that has been quite useful. Actually, my own organization, we do the majority of our advocacy virtually, and I was commenting to Sumit, I believe, last night that the internet has really revolutionized the way we share and consume information, and it's certainly been helpful in our advocacy, particularly in a context where doing on-the-ground work can be dangerous or at least certainly difficult.
Anyone else want to jump in? Okay. Getting affirmation from different panelists to the same answer.
Hi, I'm Megan Anderson. I'm with State DRL, and I manage our programming in Africa. So this is a question for Michael. South Africa. South Africa as an example for the continent, especially as an example for SADC. We're not seeing it. What is it going to take for South Africa to grow here and recognize its constitution and the example it has set, and make this less about being an anti-Western movement and more about being a pro-African movement, an African-owned LGBT movement on the continent?
I wish I had an answer. For those of you who don't know, our country hasn't had the best record in terms of international relations when it comes to the promotion of LGBTI rights in the world, and particularly on the African continent. A couple of years back, I think the high watermark was when we sponsored a bill in front of a draft resolution in front of the UN Human Rights Commission. And I think that was the first time the Human Rights Commission recognized the need to protect sexual orientation. Apart from that, our department refused, our International Affairs Department refused to speak out when certain things were happening in Uganda. I've made the argument before that our Constitution, and it comes from a legal perspective, but our Constitution does place an obligation on our state to ensure that their foreign policy is infused with human rights values, including LGBTI rights. And I think at the dawn of our constitutional democracy, I think that was the sentiment within our government, and our former President Nelson Mandela spoke about that need. In recent years, that has dissipated somewhat, and the excuse they give is pragmatic reasons. I don't know, unfortunately.
Okay. Hi, my name is Madushi, and hopefully one day I will be like you guys and be an activist. So my question has kind of two parts. The first one is kind of regarding Richie's point on the perception of LGBTI rights as a foreign imposition. And I was kind of just wondering if the rest of the panel could kind of expand on that, especially because in many other parts of the world, like in the Middle East or in my home country of India, LGBTI issues are perceived as like un-Islamic, un-Indian, and kind of that's a big barrier. And then the second part of my question was regarding the issue of prioritization. One argument that I've heard from like family members is that while LGBTI issues are important and like it's important to promote their rights, it shouldn't be a priority because there's so many other issues that are a priority, like the broader issue of poverty, or like, for example, in India, rape, and so kind of LGBTI issues should take a step back. So I was just wondering how the rest of the panelists kind of take on that issue when confronted with the idea that it's important, but maybe they should wait a little bit.
Thank you.
Can I start? Before I answer your question, I just quickly want to maybe go back to the previous ones. And I think it just goes down to the fact that we don't have... I think the room there for change is through civil society organizations, if we can get it up, to ensure that there's pressure on government. And like, as I said previously, that isn't the case. In terms of this idea that gay rights is anti-Asian or anti-Islamic or anti-African or un-African, I think what is proved somewhat successful in a South African context is where we've started to show that before the UK and the rest of Europe colonized Africa, is that many African tribes were actually practicing different versions of what we would broadly classify as gay and lesbian relationships. And I think it's just highlighting that issue that it didn't come from the West. And in many ways, that narrative has been taken away because I think there's many people who have now shown that the current persecution and stigmatization that we see in Africa is actually as a result of colonization, that it was Western laws that came into Africa. So that's a way that the narrative has started to change. In terms of a strategy to counter the argument that it's not the time for LGBTI persons to be seeking recognition, well, to relate to the South African experience, we were at a point where there was a need to recognize principles of equality and non-discrimination, and if that is what we're seeking, then surely that includes sexual orientation. And I think what was successful in the South African context was ensuring that the LGBTI community and the discrimination that they faced in the past was seen as part of a more broad oppression or particular ideology that was being implemented. So I think it's trying to create the narrative that it should be seen as a pertinent issue because it relates so much to other types of, so many other forms of discrimination and oppression that we see.
Anyone else want to weigh in on either of these questions?
Yes, in the Caribbean, we've had a similar strategy. You know, we are able to show historically that LGBTI expressions have existed in the Caribbean, and that in fact the sort of criminalization has directly been as a result of our being colonized. So our unnatural connection law is a direct analog of the UK's section 377 of the old penal code, in which we were much more tolerant as a people, much more accepting of heterodox sexualities and gender identities. One of the things that we do in our own advocacy is refer to two phrases: Zami, which, as some people might know, is actually the name of Audre Lorde's magnum opus. Audre Lorde was Grenadian, by the way, and Makomeman. Now, those two phrases are actually very antique phrases. They're Grenadian phrases, but they're very antique. So what we argue is that why would these phrases have existed historically in Grenada, in the Grenadian context, if the people to whom they refer did not exist? And that argument has certainly worked to a degree. In relation to the prioritization argument, I always ask, well, who gets to decide? Because prioritization is never value neutral. Who's to argue, for instance, that a development-related issue is more important than LGBTI people being killed or discriminated against? And it's also important to show that they don't necessarily operate in silos. Well, rape is more important than LGBTI issues, okay, but rape often occurs of lesbian women, for reasons that people call corrective. So there's a lot of kind of cross-cutting between the two. It's not exactly as insular as issues are not as insular as people make them out to be.
I just wanted to respond to the second one because I believe the two panelists have talked about how they've approached in terms of LGBTI rights as a foreign concept. I think in terms of prioritization, and this is something that you will constantly get, we have far more important issues to think about: poverty, economic, social rights. Well, so do LGBTI groups. You can be gay and still face poverty. And so the argument has always been, and should be, the intersectionality of those rights, that you can't separate one right from another right, and that LGBTI rights are part and parcel of the human rights discourse, and you can't prioritize one over the other because they're all linked. And as Richie had said, you can be part of an LGBTI grouping and still be raped. So the experiences, the difference are that as a group we are more vulnerable. We experience it by, the challenges are different in terms of degrees of experiences, and again depends on the context. So for me, I've always used this argument that it's all the rights are connected, they're interlinked. This idea of it being intersectional is critical in explaining why it's important not to take that particular line of who do we prioritize now.
Summit, you want to say something?
I just wanted to add a couple of things there. So this idea that Richie's talking about of reclaiming this argument has worked in Nepal and it worked in Thailand, where they said that a third gender identity is actually part of who we are in these countries, and Sunil very much used that argument to advocate for LGBTI rights in Nepal, and it seems that under the draft constitution that the current regime in Thailand has put forward, that there is also recognition of third gender. And you raised India, and I think, so I was trying to think about that question with regards to India, and I think it's a very important question you raised, because what's happening in India at the moment is there is this re-questioning now about the constitutional identity of India. And if there was one idea in which India was founded, in the Constitution of 1950, it was one India, right? So no more caste. It's not that we are Indian Muslim and Indian Hindus, we are one India. And I think that the current, not necessarily the current government, but certainly a lot of the discourse around the current government is reopening all of these questions. And I think that, if anything, LGBTI should be part of that debate, to say that, this wasn't what the Constitution of India was about, discrimination based on who we are. So I see it very much as part of the equality debate raging in India at the moment.
Thanks. I'm going to take these two questions here together, and then we're going to close off the Q&A, because we're almost at our time. So if you want to introduce yourselves, ask your questions, and then the panel can respond to the two of them.
Hi, my name is Aisha, and I work on the Honduras desk in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau. And I see that we've been talking a lot about marriage equality, and it's going hand in hand with Constitution in some instances. And I kind of wanted to ask about the spots that they're is a place to address other issues that affect the LGBTQ community in the Constitution. And just coming from the perspective of Honduras, right now, not necessarily those rights aren't there for marriage equality. However, they have addressed issues of like HIV or protecting persons with HIV that are also in the LGBTQ community. And so I just kind of wanted to see where you guys would see these issues fitting in, because they're also important to equality, and they overlap with people who may not necessarily identify as well.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you all. My name is Pepe Julian Onzima. I work with Sexual Minorities Uganda, and I come from Uganda, but currently in the States as a Reagan Fassel Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. Two questions about coalition building. How do you sustain after a win? For instance, we formed a civil society coalition to fight the anti-gay law in Uganda. And when we petitioned the law in court and won, the group sort of, became reluctant. But how do you rebuild that energy to keep fighting other legislations that are restrictive? And I'm mindful of time, but as I speak right now, there's talks of reintroduction of another bill. But also we have an NGO bill that is being discussed, of which it's targeting LGBT groups like mine. And we're also having a constitutional review, which a petition by religious leaders has been tabled to the parliament and the constitutional body to further criminalize LGBT people in the constitution. We already have same-sex marriage prohibited, but there's efforts to further criminalize us in the constitution. So just speaking your minds about that, also to let you know that my project here with the fellowship is actually looking at the constitution, because I kind of foresaw that the challenges we are facing right now would come. And so for me, this discussion is really important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to table those two questions before our panel, and I'm going to add one more because we are almost at our time. And I feel incumbent as the U.S. Institute of Peace, and again, harking back on our partnership with the State Department, maybe if any of you want to address what can organizations like USIP and IDEA do to support those of you on the front lines, those of you on the ground? What can the U.S. do from an international policy perspective, and other countries as well? We've heard you discuss some of the ways we might interfere, in fact, with your efforts, but is there a positive role that we can play?
Yeah, so to answer your question first, I definitely think there's a positive role that can be played. One, providing support to local NGOs, so support in the form of funding for different projects, in the form of capacity building trainings so that advocates are able to be better advocates, and also non-public diplomatic pressure. So at the UPR, for instance, the Universal Periodic Review, that's an excellent opportunity for states to kind of give states recommendations that isn't sort of seen as an imperial imposition, and also just kind of one-on-one diplomatic conversations is always very useful. So those are the ways that I think it certainly can be useful. As per the other questions, how do you sustain after a win? I really don't know. I don't have. We've not had many wins in the Caribbean, so. But, as to the question, I don't remember your name, sorry, but from the Honduran context, marriage equality is actually not on the agenda for the Caribbean, yeah? It's something that completely closes the discussion. So we've been very deliberate in our advocacy attempts. We've been very particular about avoiding that discussion, actually. And so what we've been pushing for is constitutional expansions of the anti-discrimination section in the Bill of Rights to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and HIV as well. Because in the Caribbean, as with the rest of the world, MSM or a particularly at-risk population for HIV/AIDS.
Anyone else want to jump in?
The question from Honduras?
Yeah.
Because I just wanted to mention that we had a participant from Kenya who couldn't be here today, but he would have an interesting answer to your question, because in Kenya, the constitution defines marriage as being between a man and a woman, okay? And then the constitution went to referendum. He led LGBTI advocates to advocate for the constitution, to pass the constitution. And he had to explain to them that from where we're coming from, to actually have a robust Bill of Rights, a democratic constitution, and ways to exercise our rights through a non-discrimination clause, which doesn't specify sexual orientation, is a victory for us to start with. And indeed, so it's proved. So the reason he can't be here is because he's arguing a case where the court decided that, so he wasn't able to register his NGO. It's called the Kenyan LGBTI Commission or something like this. And he wasn't able to register it because they said that the purposes of the NGO were immoral and possibly criminal also. And the court overturned that decision, said it was against his freedom of association. And so now he's able to have an NGO, now he can raise money, now he can organize in public, and that's one step forward. So I think Kenya is actually a good example for why, as well as LGBTI specific rights and recognition, sort of overall democratic and robust Bill of Rights and democratic framework is a good thing to include in your advocacy toolkit. Thanks.
Okay. Just in relation to sustaining after the win, I think you have to celebrate the wins, and then you have to analyse them and document them, because I think in your analysis, you can find out, exactly how that you have an idea, but you can document exactly how that was achieved, and also the things that you might have done differently. And I think from that, and we would have done that along the way with our strategic planning and our evaluation and our internal evaluation, and that helps then to shape the next steps and where the next fight is, I suppose. In relation to some of the work maybe that would be helpful for USIP is, I think, I've certainly really enjoyed my couple of days here, but I think there's room and scope for more of this, getting activists together, advocates from around the world who are working on common issues to come together. Over the last 8 years, I've had the privilege of doing that on a number of occasions, and I've always found it extremely useful. And I've developed relationships and friendships with people from here in the US and South Africa and other countries that have been very valuable, both personally and professionally, because you can share ideas, bounce things off each other, learn from each other's strategies and wins and failures. So there's enormous support in that. And even if it isn't always possible to bring people together to meet face to face, even putting people in touch with networks and helping people share their research and analysis, I think all of that would be very helpful.
Thanks. Well, listen, I want to thank our panelists deeply for sharing your experiences and your insights with us here today in building this advocacy guide. Your blood, sweat, and tears are not just a testament to what's been achieved in your countries, but what can be achieved around the world. And we're certainly honored and privileged to be a very, very small part of bringing that knowledge, expanding it further out, and being able to stand behind you. I mean, far behind you in some cases. But to be able to say that we're on the right side. And so thank you for allowing us to be a small piece of that. Thank you, everyone, for coming today, sharing your own views and experiences on this really important matter. And with that, enjoy the rest of the day.